How many of you sang during the anti-war movement, Blowin' in the Wind? Written by Bob Dylan and made famous as the song sung on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial by Peter, Paul, and Mary, just moments before Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King delivered the I Have a Dream speech. It was one of the classic protest songs that would later become incorporated into Protestant hymnals and identified as the quintessential Boomer experience. The question of how many roads must a man walk down would later be incorporated as the ultimate question in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in 1978. But did you know that Dylan didn't write the tune to Blowin' in the Wind? It's an adaptation of the Negro spiritual No More Auction Block. In a Trumpian United States, I feel ourselves being herded into moral dichotomies that have the net effect of obscuring our moral clarity. While politicians focus in on hot-button social issues rather than real-time, much more broad, local, and sweeping issues like early intervention school programs or living wages, our fight or flight brains are pushed into these simplified moral dilemmas that only seem to increase knee-jerk, tweetable responses. So back to Blowin' in the Wind, a song beloved, I can tell, this morning by many Unitarian Universalists, the words crafted by a social icon, Bob Dylan, and yet the tune adapted for a long time without any attribution, being taken from a Negro spiritual. So what are we to make of this? Can we still sing this song? Is it theft? I think a crucial part of what we do here together is to build the discernment muscles, if you will, to stay in the complex places instead of ramping up our amygdalas in a feel-righteous rally. How do we get moral clarity? And what is justice? It comes through the human need, I believe, to be known. Moral clarity arises out of the context of a relational faith that rather than handing down dogma, instead insists that we enter together into that which we do not know. And when we truly belong to one another, the right thing becomes clearer. So take for a moment, warning, Roy Moore. In the sea of Me Too posts by female-identified persons and men who've been sexually harassed and assaulted comes allegations that a candidate for political office in Alabama had unwanted sexual contact with minors when he was in his 30s and they were 14 and 15. Now the media is all afire about Roy Moore. How many folks have heard about Roy Moore and some? Okay. He should step down, the pleas have come, it goes on. And then someone this last week mentions that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was 14. And so you know Joseph was much older and married her, and so we shouldn't judge. And the liberal religious rage on into the night over Twitter. But what I want to suggest is that Roy Moore is not really a tough moral dilemma. And we are spending a lot of time on Roy Moore. But what of someone like this person? Anybody know who this is? Mm-hmm. Louis C.K. Louis C.K., who admits and apologizes for sexually harassing and abusing women after he got caught. What do we make of that apology? Is there room for a Louis C.K. to atone and be brought back into community? I think of the universalist message that no one is beyond God's love, and the knowledge that there are far more Louis C.K.'s in the world than Roy Moores, including in our community. And how will we belong to one another and know one another across the chasms of injury and shame? That would seem a moral dilemma that is greatly in need of a non-tweetable response from religious progressives. Now you might be thinking, Robin, I thought today was about veterans. I'm getting there. Memorial Day and Veterans Day, the former honors those who gave, in Lincoln's words, the ultimate measure for their country, their lives, while Veterans Day honors typically the living veterans who did return home. While giving of one's life may be the ultimate measure according to Lincoln, a living veteran who physically survives the war comes home with their own measure of sacrifice. For some, this includes physical injuries, and for many, if not all, emotional and psychological trauma that they carry with them the rest of their lives. Some veterans find that their family has changed after months and sometimes years of sleepless nights, as Bill shared in his story. Other veterans will seek out alcohol or drugs to numb the effects of PTSD, and for others, as Reverend David Pyle told us this morning, there is no home to come back to. There can be a sense and a real experience that there's no community to thank them, to welcome them, to support them. They travel through our world no longer in uniform, and now invisible and unknown. I've spent a lot of time thinking lately about how the protests during the Vietnam War largely led to the end of the draft. I think a lot of folks would agree that the protests led to the end of a draft as a practice in our country. It's hard to imagine today, as we face the brink of war over tweets with North Korea, that politicians would put forth a draft again, given the backlash. And yet we have still fought many wars since Vietnam. Thailand, Lebanon, Grenada, Libya, the Persian Gulf, Panama, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq once more, Pakistan, Libya, Nigeria, Yemen, we could go on. But no draft. So who is fighting these wars? Between 1964 and 1972, 1.857 million people were drafted into the Vietnam War. Today, the U.S. military is served by 2.26 million people, which is roughly less than 1% of the U.S. population. Now, that doesn't mean we're in fewer wars. Conflict has changed, and to some extent, we have further boots on the ground. But the makeup of the military has changed as well in that time. Where the draft brought some better distribution of those who served, albeit still biased with exemptions, today's military is not nearly as reflective of the general population of the United States as it was during the draft. There are more African American women, for example, in the military today. More folks from either the upper echelon of affluent classes whose families have political careers after service in the military. And more, the military today is reporting lower numbers of entry-level education by enlistees. 30% of enlistees have not graduated from high school when they enter the military. Now, not all military families are from the lowest socioeconomic structures, but most of them do represent the lower middle class and working class. Middle class white folks compose a good portion, but we find that the households of those enlisting in the military on average are about $60,000 a year. They are also increasingly from rural areas, neighborhoods where military service is praised and valued. They are not from communities like Summit, New Jersey, and mostly those serving in the military are from regions in our country outside of the Northeast. Now, of course, those who fought the draft did not intend for the privatization of the military, and yet that is an unintended consequence today, beloved. She's a little pixelated, but can you tell who that is? Kerry Washington, or Olivia Pope, as she's known in our household, of Scandal. One of the things I love about the show Scandal, and I've learned a lot of moral lessons from Scandal, sometimes moral what not to do's, but Scandal demonstrates how a private firm is created, right, to essentially run the government. And then we learn in this season, sorry if you're just catching up on Netflix, that there's a group called B613 that's a secret, off-the-books, private military company that is running all of the wars and armed conflicts that the United States is in. What I love about Scandal is that it takes just a little bit of edge to point out the reality of privatization in our country today. Another effect of not having a draft is that communities like ours have largely undervalued military service because of our positions on the war. And yet conflict in the world continues to arise, many out of our own creation, as well as conflict we are called into by our allies and international commitments. And while it wasn't intended, the impact of having less than 1% of Americans serving in the military means that roughly 95% of Americans do not know anyone in their family or intimate circle who is actively serving. 95% of Americans do not know someone in their family or their intimate circle who is actively serving in the military. Think about what impact that has on how we decide when we deploy and who makes those decisions and how we are equipped or not equipped to welcome our soldiers home. Think about how we talk about the military, not our military, not our soldiers. But if you watch most news broadcasts, it's the soldiers, the military. Increasingly, veterans return to a country that does not know them, and the impact is deadly. This is a photo of Damian Rodriguez, who was a decorated military sergeant in the Marines. And Sergeant Rodriguez had returned home after several deployments in Iraq. And this past spring, in April, he was out celebrating with another Marine because a recent class of their students had done quite well and they had had their graduation. And so Sergeant Rodriguez and his colleague were having a good time. They'd gone out for a few drinks, and they went down a popular street in Portland and decided to go into a restaurant. It happened to be an Iraqi restaurant. They sat down at a table, and on the security footage, we can see that they sat at that table for about an hour as servers came back and forth, and they didn't order anything. They just drank water and they were talking. And then all of a sudden on the video footage, you see Sergeant Rodriguez stand up and look around, almost a little disoriented or as if he's looking for something. And then as a server approaches him, he picks up a chair and strikes the man over the head and down onto the shoulder. Sergeant Rodriguez is charged with a hate crime, and he is forced to immediately resign. He is facing felony charges. He will go before the court later this year into early next year for a trial. Now, immediately after this happened, progressive groups across Portland began to cry out for justice and began to protest and lift up that Sergeant Rodriguez had committed a hate crime. But consider this part of Sergeant Rodriguez's story. In April of 2004, 12 years prior, Sergeant Rodriguez had been taking his squad out for a foot patrol on what was a routine patrol, they thought, in a city in Iraq. And while they were on patrol, they noticed that everything was very unusually quiet in the city. And so the soldiers became concerned because they thought this was probably not a good sign. And sure enough, gunshots rang out, and 2 soldiers besides Sergeant Rodriguez were killed instantly. A soldier to his right had his carotid artery hit. And so Sergeant Rodriguez grabbed the soldier and the rest of his squad and had them pull back behind a building as he applied pressure to the young man's artery to stop the bleeding. He talked him through it and started telling jokes to keep the young man alert and calm. In the hour-long assault across the city, insurgents had planned an attack that left many soldiers across the city dead. Now, Sergeant Rodriguez would return home, as would the soldier whose neck that he had held and kept him from bleeding out. But Sergeant Rodriguez's mother says that she knew when she met him at the airport, and she saw how empty his eyes were, that something had changed. Sergeant Rodriguez has PTSD and has received treatment for his PTSD. But still, this trauma continues. So what is justice in this case? 12 years later, in the same month and the same weather, in a restaurant, was it a hate crime or was it a flashback? And what is justice when the full story becomes known? Veteran military chaplain George Tiger writes of our human need to be known, and I think ultimately Universalism teaches us that the right thing cannot be known in a vacuum, that our individualism is insufficient for moral clarity, that our need to be known can guide us to know one another and get more proximate to justice. If I'm honest, I don't know a lot. I have a lot of information thrown my way and many facts available to me, more than any previous generation has had. But I don't know people very well. And ultimately, facts can have many interpretations, but people, they tell us the impact. And I think really, if we're going to find a future as a nation, it will be a future that requires forgiveness. And for God's sakes, how are we going to forgive one another if we don't even know each other? In a relational theology like ours, if we are to believe in the power and promise of covenantal theology, then the most progressive thing we can do is to resist the violence of unknowing. In our theology, it is violent to be cut off from one another, to live deep in these pockets of isolation, and it is dangerous. A Monday, I sat in a restaurant with a bar, and there were 2 soldiers at the bar. I was at the restaurant section, just to be clear. And the news was on, and the story about the shooting in Texas and the identity of the shooter flashed across the screen, and they started talking about how he was a veteran. And the bartender asked the soldiers, "Have you heard about this?" And I tensed up, feeling really badly for those soldiers who might just have wanted to have a beer. It was 5 o'clock somewhere. And everything in my upstate New York, slightly waspy raising said, "Leave it alone, lady. Don't ask questions like that of people you don't know." But surprisingly, they responded. They talked about limiting gun access and support for veterans and bump stocks and how it wasn't really a thing that anyone would actually use and they should be outlawed. And they talked about the war. And then one of the soldiers asked the bartender for her number. And she smiled broadly and handed it to him. And I thought, that wasn't so hard. Knowing one another. In a country where pundits now toss around Gold Star families on all sides like political hockey pucks, and where the great immorality of our time would seem like heat to gold to refine our moral discernment, but instead it only distracts us from the shiny, tweetable things and makes the plain beyond measure morality seem everyday and obvious, and where our certainty grows in a time when we know less of one another and ultimately less of the world, and where we are alone in our facts and others are unknown in theirs, and our soldiers have become the military. In that country, we must begin again. We must learn how to know one another again. We must reach out past the idolatry of individualism and the sin of self-professed answers and the silos of social media into the human endeavor, the rickety old bird in hand. The answers known and a living past barriers and borders to allow the evolution of the human spirit once more, for justice itself in these times to evolve, to change by our willingness to be shaped by what we do not know and who we have refused to know, silently and at times willfully. So, beloved, let us put down the weapons of righteousness and a limiting liberalism and study this culture war no more.